The crimson glow of dawn had barely begun to brush the eastern sky when Josephine Valenti realized she could no longer hide her secret. At 18, she pressed a trembling hand to her still flat stomach, knowing the life growing inside her would soon be impossible to conceal beneath the proper dresses her family insisted she wear. The year was 1876, and in Gonzales, Texas, an unmarried woman with child was as good as dead in the eyes of society, especially the daughter of Bartholomew Valenti, the town's most prominent banker. Josephine's fingers clutched the wooden railing of her balcony as she gazed out at the sleeping town. The Valenti mansion stood on the highest hill overlooking Gonzales, a symbol of her family's wealth and respectability. A respectability she had compromised when she had fallen for the honeyed words of a traveling salesman who had promised to return for her a promise as empty as the letters she'd sent after him. "Miss Josephine, you're up mighty early." Martha, their housekeeper since Josephine was a child, appeared at the doorway, her dark eyes filled with concern. "I couldn't sleep, Martha." Josephine turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Martha approached, lowering her voice. "You've been sick every morning for 2 weeks now. Your mama's starting to ask questions." Josephine's composure cracked. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Father will disown me. You know how he is about family honor." Martha's weathered hand closed over Josephine's. "You need to leave before they figure it out." "Your cousin in San Antonio would tell father immediately," Josephine finished. "I have nowhere to go." "There's a cattle drive leaving tomorrow," Martha said carefully. "My nephew's riding with them. They need a cook's assistant." "It ain't proper work for a lady, but I'm hardly a lady anymore, am I?" Josephine said bitterly. Martha squeezed her hand. "You listen here. One mistake don't define your whole life, child, but staying here might end it before it truly begins." That evening, as her parents hosted their weekly dinner for Gonzales elite families, Josephine packed a small valise with her plainest dresses, her mother's locket, and the meager savings she'd accumulated from birthday gifts. When the house finally fell silent around midnight, she slipped down the servants' staircase where Martha waited with a bundle of food and a worn but sturdy cloak. "The cattle drive leaves at dawn from Miller's Creek," Martha whispered. "Ask for Jake Hampton. He's the trail boss. Tell him you're Martha's friend looking for honest work." Josephine embraced the older woman fiercely. "I'll find a way to repay you someday. You just take care of yourself and that little one," Martha replied, patting Josephine's still flat stomach. "Now go before someone hears us." Under the cover of darkness, Josephine Valenti fled the only home she had ever known. The cattle drive camp was a chaotic scene when Josephine arrived just before dawn. Cowboys moved with purpose among the herd, while wagons were being loaded with supplies. She clutched Martha's letter in her gloved hand, heart pounding beneath her modest traveling dress. "Excuse me." She approached a young man securing provisions to a chuck wagon. "I'm looking for Mr. Hampton." The cowboy looked up, surprise evident in his face at seeing a well-dressed woman in their camp. "The boss is over by them horses," he said, pointing toward a tall figure adjusting a saddle on a powerful black stallion. Jake Hampton stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the Texas sun. When he turned at her approach, Josephine was struck by eyes as blue as a summer sky, set in a face weathered by wind and sun. He couldn't have been more than 26 or 27, but there was something in his expression that suggested he'd seen more of life than most men twice his age. "Mr. Hampton," Josephine summoned her courage. "My name is Josephine Valenti. Martha Simmons sent me. I understand you need a cook's assistant." Jake Hampton's expression didn't change as he studied her, from her slightly trembling hands to the quality of her clothing that, despite being her plainest, still marked her as someone unaccustomed to manual labor. "Martha's letter said you were looking for honest work," he said finally, his voice a deep rumble. "It didn't mention you were Bartholomew Valenti's daughter." Josephine's heart sank. "You know who I am. Everyone in 3 counties knows the Valentis." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What's a banker's daughter doing looking for work on a cattle drive to Kansas?" "I need to leave Gonzales," she said simply, unwilling to share her secret with this stranger. "Why?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. "My reasons are my own, Mr. Hampton." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough. But a cattle drive ain't no place for a lady. It's hard, dirty work, long days, longer nights. Men who ain't seen civilization in months." "I'm stronger than I look," Josephine insisted, "and I learn quickly." Jake studied her for another long moment before sighing. "Old Cookie could use the help, I suppose, but first sign of trouble, I'm sending you back to town." "We clear," relief flooded through her. "Perfectly clear, Mr. Hampton, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said grimly. "You'll be earning every penny." He gestured toward an older man with a white beard working at the chuck wagon. "That's Ezekiel Cook. Everyone calls him Cookie. He'll show you what to do." Cookie proved to be a gruff but patient teacher, showing Josephine how to manage the heavy cast iron pots and maintain the fire at the proper temperature. By midday, her hands were blistered, her back ached from the unfamiliar labor, and her dress was stained with grease and flour. But for the first time since discovering her condition, she felt a sense of purpose. As the cattle drive moved north out of Gonzales County, Josephine settled into a routine. Up before dawn to help Cookie prepare breakfast, pack the wagon, drive all day across the rugged terrain, then set up the evening meal after they made camp. The work was exhausting, but it left her little time to dwell on her situation or the future that awaited her. The Cowboys largely kept their distance, treating her with awkward respect after Jake had made it clear that any disrespect toward her would be dealt with severely. Only Cookie and Jake regularly spoke to her beyond requesting more coffee or thanking her for meals. A week into the journey, as Josephine was washing dishes in a creek after the evening meal, she became aware of someone standing behind her. "You're doing better than I expected," Jake said, crouching down nearby to fill his canteen. "Cookie says you're a quick study." "Thank you," she replied, surprised by the compliment. "Still doesn't explain why Bartholomew Valenti's daughter is out here instead of attending socials and planning her wedding to some suitable gentleman." His tone was conversational, but his eyes were shrewd. Josephine focused on scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot. "Perhaps I didn't care for the suitable gentleman of Gonzales." Jake didn't sound convinced. "Your father will be looking for you, you know. Man like that has connections all over Texas." Fear clutched at Josephine's heart. "Do you intend to send word to him?" Jake studied her for a long moment. "No. Whatever you're running from, it must be serious to make you choose this life instead." He stood, adjusting his hat. "But secrets have a way of revealing themselves on the trail, Miss Valenti. Space is too tight and time too long for them to stay buried." As Jake walked away, Josephine placed a protective hand over her stomach. She had perhaps 2 months, 3 at most, before her condition would become obvious. By then, they would reach the railhead in Kansas, and she would need to disappear again. The days blurred together as the cattle drive pushed north through Texas. Josephine's hands hardened with calluses, her fair skin darkened under the relentless sun, and her muscles grew accustomed to the demanding physical labor. She learned to bake bread in a Dutch oven, to make coffee strong enough to satisfy the Cowboys, and to preserve the meager, fresh vegetables they carried. At night, when the camp was quiet except for the soft lowing of cattle and the occasional cough or snore from the sleeping cowboys, Josephine would lie awake in her small tent beside the chuck wagon, worrying about her future and that of her unborn child. She had managed to save most of her wages, but it wouldn't be enough to start a new life somewhere. One evening, as a spring thunderstorm rolled across the plains, Cookie announced he was feeling poorly and asked Josephine to deliver Jake's dinner to him. Jake had ridden ahead to scout the trail and was keeping watch on a small rise overlooking their camp. Josephine found him silhouetted against the darkening sky, his attention fixed on the horizon where lightning flashed. "Mr. Hampton, Cookie sent your dinner." Jake turned, taking the plate with a nod of thanks. "Storm's coming in fast. Cattle will be restless tonight." Josephine should have simply returned to camp, but something kept her there. Perhaps it was the unusual vulnerability in seeing this strong, reserved man outlined against the coming storm. "Were you always a cowboy?" she asked impulsively. A hint of surprise crossed his face before he answered. "No, served in the war when I was barely old enough to hold a rifle. After that, tried my hand at farming, but the drought took everything." He gestured toward the vast prairie around them. "This life suits me better. No roots to lose. No family." The question slipped out before she could stop herself. "Parents died before the war. Had a brother, but he didn't make it back from Gettysburg." Jake's expression remained impassive, but something in his voice revealed the depth of that loss. "You learned to make your own way." Josephine thought about the life growing inside her, a child who might never know its father, who might be born without family or name. "I suppose we all must, eventually." Jake studied her face in the gathering darkness. "You're a long way from making your own way, Miss Valenti. Whatever you're running from, it follows you like a shadow." Before Josephine could respond, a massive crack of thunder split the air. The sky opened and rain began pouring down in sheets. Without hesitation, Jake removed his slicker and draped it over her shoulders. "Get back to camp," he ordered, already moving toward his horse. "That storm will spook the herd if we're not careful." Josephine ran back through the downpour, Jake's coat protecting her from the worst of the rain. By the time she reached the chuck wagon, the cattle drive was in chaos. Lightning had indeed spooked the herd, and the sound of thundering hooves and shouting cowboys filled the air as they struggled to prevent a full stampede. For hours, the men worked to control the frightened animals while Josephine and Cookie secured the camp against the driving rain. It was well past midnight when the cowboys began straggling back, soaked and exhausted. "Anyone seen the boss?" Cookie asked as he handed out mugs of hot coffee to the returning men. A knot of worry formed in Josephine's stomach when no one answered affirmatively. Jake's slicker was still draped over her shoulders, meaning he had faced the storm without protection. Two more cowboys returned, supporting a third whose arm hung at an odd angle. As Cookie moved to help them, Josephine kept watching the darkness beyond the camp, hoping to see Jake's tall figure emerge. Finally, when most had settled into their bedrolls despite the damp, Jake's horse appeared at the edge of camp. The animal was walking slowly, and Jake slumped forward in the saddle, one hand gripping the pommel with white knuckles. "Mr. Hampton." Josephine rushed forward as the horse came to a stop. In the lantern light, she could see blood staining the side of Jake's shirt. "You're hurt." "Just a fall," he muttered, but his face was pale beneath its tan. "Horse got spooked by the lightning, threw me into some rocks." With help from two nearby cowboys, Jake was eased from the saddle. He tried to stand but stumbled, and Josephine found herself slipping under his arm to support him. "Get him to my tent," Cookie directed. "It's driest there." Inside Cookie's tent, they lowered Jake onto a bedroll. When Josephine helped remove his sodden shirt, she discovered a deep gash along his ribs and bruising that suggested he might have cracked a few as well. "I'll fetch the medical kit," Cookie said, disappearing into the rain. Left alone with Jake, Josephine wet a clean cloth and began gently cleaning the wound. His skin was hot beneath her fingers, surprisingly smooth over the hard muscle. "You've got a gentle touch," Jake murmured, his eyes half closed with pain. "My mother insisted I learn basic nursing," Josephine replied, trying to ignore the strange fluttering in her stomach that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. "She said it was a lady's duty to care for the sick and injured." "Seems there's more to being a lady than your mother taught," Jake said with the ghost of a smile. "Don't imagine she pictured you driving a chuck wagon across Texas." Despite herself, Josephine smiled back. "No, I suppose not." Cookie returned with the medical supplies, and together they cleaned and bandaged Jake's wound. By the time they finished, Jake had fallen into an exhausted sleep. "You stay with him," Cookie told Josephine. "I need to check on the others, make sure no one else got hurt in that commotion." Alone again, Josephine sat beside Jake, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly look at him, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it was too long at the nape of his neck. This man had given her sanctuary when she needed it most, had protected her without knowing why she needed protection. As rain drummed against the canvas above, Josephine realized with a jolt of surprise that she was developing feelings for Jake Hampton, feelings that could only lead to more heartbreak. For what man would want a woman carrying another's child? Jake recovered quickly from his injury, though the deep bruising along his ribs made riding painful for several days. During that time, he took to riding in the chuck wagon beside Josephine, directing the drive from there rather than from horseback. Those days of close proximity changed something between them. Conversation came more easily, and Josephine found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Gonzales, while Jake spoke of his years drifting across the West after the war. "You ever been to Kansas before?" he asked one afternoon as they crossed into Indian territory. "No, I've never been farther north than Dallas," Josephine admitted. "What's it like?" "Different, quieter than Texas in some ways." He adjusted his position, wincing slightly at the pain in his ribs. "Good farmland, though. Man could make something of himself there." "Is that what you want to do, settle down and farm?" Josephine couldn't imagine this restless man confined to one place. Jake was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "Maybe, one day, with the right reason." His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the horizon. "What about you? What happens when we reach Abilene?" the question she'd been avoiding. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Find work, I suppose." "As what, a cook, if necessary?" "I could also work as a seamstress or perhaps a teacher's assistant." Josephine had considered her options endlessly during sleepless nights. "I'm not afraid of hard work anymore." Jake studied her profile. "No, I can see that." After a moment, he added, "Whatever you're running from, Josephine, it must be significant for you to choose this life over the one you had." The use of her first name startled her. In the weeks since joining the cattle drive, he had only ever called her Miss Valenti. "It is," she said quietly, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. Jake's eyes followed the movement, and a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He said nothing, but Josephine felt exposed, as if her secret was now written plainly for him to see. That evening, after the camp had settled and most of the men were gathered around the fire trading stories, Jake approached Josephine as she finished washing the dinner dishes. "Walk with me?" he asked, his voice low. Heart pounding, Josephine followed him away from the campfire, beyond the chuck wagon to the edge of camp where the vast prairie stretched out under a blanket of stars. "I'm not one to pry into another person's business," Jake began, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "But if I'm right about why you left Gonzales—" He paused. "You shouldn't be alone when your time comes." Josephine's breath caught. "How long have you known?" "Suspected for a while. The way you avoid certain foods in the morning, how careful you are when lifting anything heavy." Jake finally turned to face her. "I've had sisters, cousins, I know the signs." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes. "Are you going to send me away?" "No." The word was firm, immediate. "That's not who I am. The father." Josephine swallowed hard. "He was passing through town. Said he loved me, that he'd come back. I was naive enough to believe him." Jake's expression hardened. "Man who do that doesn't deserve the title of father. My parents would disown me if they knew. In their world, this is unforgivable." The tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. "I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to." In a gesture that surprised her, Jake reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "You have me." Josephine looked up at him, confusion mingling with a sudden, dangerous hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean I won't let you face this alone." His voice was low, intense. "When we reach Abilene, you'll need someone to stand between you and the judgment of others. I can be that someone." "Why would you do that for me? You barely know me." Jake was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "I know enough. I know you're brave enough to leave everything behind rather than bring shame to your family. I know you work harder than any woman I've ever met, and I know that child deserves a chance at a good life." He met her gaze steadily. "I will stand between you and shame, Josephine. You have my word on that." Something warm unfurled in Josephine's chest, something dangerously like love. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to express the depth of her gratitude. As they walked back to camp side by side, Josephine felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her future and her child's might hold something more than loneliness and struggle. The cattle drive continued north, crossing into Kansas, as summer heat settled over the plains. Josephine's condition became increasingly difficult to hide as her 4th month of pregnancy advanced. She let out the seams of her dresses as much as possible and took to wearing one of Cookie's large aprons, but observant eyes would soon notice the changes in her body. Jake, true to his word, kept her secret. He assigned her less strenuous tasks without making it obvious to the others, and made sure she had extra portions of the most nourishing food. In the evenings, they often sat together away from the main campfire, talking about their pasts and tentative plans for the future. "My father wanted me to marry Henry Blackwell," Josephine told him one evening. "Son of the local judge, said it would be a good merger of families." Jake snorted. "Sounds like he was talking about cattle, not his daughter. That's how it works in families like mine. Marriage is a business arrangement first, a personal relationship second." Josephine sighed. "Henry was perfectly nice, but there was nothing between us. No spark, no passion. And the father of your child, was there passion there?" Jake's voice was carefully neutral. Josephine considered the question honestly. "I thought so at the time. Now I think it was just the excitement of someone new, someone who talked about places I'd never seen." She looked down at her hands. "He made me feel special, chosen." I was too young to recognize the difference between flattery and genuine feeling. Jake was quiet for a moment. "How old are you, Josephine?" 18. 19 next month." Something softened in Jake's expression. "Still so young." "Old enough to know better," she countered. "Old enough to face the consequences of my choices. And brave enough to do it on your own terms." Jake's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. That counts for something." The simple touch of his hand sent a shiver through Josephine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. In that moment, she realized that what she felt for Jake Hampton was far deeper and more real than anything she'd experienced with the traveling salesman who'd fathered her child. But she had nothing to offer a man like Jake, nothing except complications and responsibility for another man's child. So she gently withdrew her hand, pretending not to notice the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. 2 days later, disaster struck. A group of cowboys from a rival outfit, drunk and looking for trouble, rode into their camp while Jake and several others were out checking the herd. "Well, looky here," one of them drawled, dismounting near the chuck wagon where Josephine was preparing dinner. "Didn't know old man Hampton had started hiring women for his drives." Josephine straightened, keeping the large wooden spoon in her hand. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" The cowboy sauntered closer, the smell of whiskey strong on his breath. "Depends on what you're offering, sweetheart." Cookie stepped forward, his ancient Colt revolver appearing in his hand. "Best move on, boys. Boss will be back soon, and he don't take kindly to uninvited guests." The leader laughed, but his eyes had a mean glint. "Just being neighborly, old man. Besides, seems to me a woman traveling with a bunch of cowboys must be mighty accommodating." Josephine felt her face flush with anger and fear. "You're mistaken, sir. Now please leave our camp." Instead of backing away, the man grabbed her arm. "Don't be like that, darling. We just want to." He never finished the sentence. A blur of motion ended with the man sprawled in the dust, blood pouring from his nose. Jake stood over him, fist still clenched, his face a mask of cold fury. "Touch her again," Jake said, his voice dangerously soft, "and they won't find enough pieces to bury you." The drunken cowboys' companions moved forward, hands hovering near their guns. Jake didn't flinch, though he was outnumbered 3-1. "This ain't your concern, Hampton," one of them growled. "We was just having some fun." The lady said, "No, that makes it my concern." Jake's hand rested casually near his holster. "Now you boys have a choice. Ride out of here peacefully, or I'll send what's left of you back to your boss in a feed sack." Something in Jake's eyes, a hardness, a certainty, made the cowboys hesitate. Their leader climbed unsteadily to his feet, wiping blood from his face. "This ain't over, Hampton." "It is for tonight," Jake replied evenly. "Mount up and ride out." With muttered curses, the cowboys complied, their leader casting one last venomous glance at Jake and Josephine before they disappeared into the gathering darkness. In the aftermath, Josephine realized she was trembling. Jake approached her slowly, as if afraid she might shatter. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle now. "No, I'm fine," she assured him, though her arm ached where the cowboy had grabbed her. "Thank you for intervening." Jake's expression darkened. "I should have been here." "I'm sorry, Josephine. You couldn't have known." She reached out impulsively and touched his arm. "You can't be everywhere at once." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Jake's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Double the watch tonight," he ordered the nearby cowboys. "Those boys might come back with reinforcements." Later, after the camp had quieted and Josephine had retreated to her small tent, Jake appeared at the entrance. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Josephine hesitated only briefly before nodding. Jake ducked inside, his large frame making the small space seem even smaller. He sat cross-legged on the ground, his hat in his hands. "I can't guarantee your safety for the rest of the drive," he said without preamble. "Word has gotten out that we have a woman with us. There are men who—" He trailed off, jaw clenching. "It's not right, but that's the reality." Fear clutched at Josephine's heart. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." Jake's response was immediate and firm. "I'm asking you to marry me." Josephine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What? Marry me?" Jake repeated, his blue eyes intent on hers. "As my wife, you'd have protection that I can't offer you otherwise. No one would dare touch you." "You can't be serious," Josephine whispered, though his expression told her he was entirely sincere. "I am. We can find a preacher in the next town, make it official." Jake leaned forward slightly. "It would solve your problem too. Your child would have a name, legitimacy." Josephine felt tears building behind her eyes. "I won't trap you in a marriage of convenience, Jake. You deserve better than that, better than taking responsibility for another man's child." "Is that what you think this is?" Jake's voice had a strange intensity. "A marriage of convenience? What else could it be? We've known each other barely 2 months." Jake set his hat aside and took her hands in his. "Josephine, I'm not offering because it's convenient. I'm offering because I care for you. Because somewhere between Gonzales and here, I started imagining a future with you in it." Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. "You can't mean that. I'm carrying another man's child." "A child who needs a father," Jake said simply. "I never had much family of my own. Maybe that's why the idea of making one appeals to me so much." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give, Josephine. It can be a marriage in name only if that's what you prefer. But it would give you security, respectability." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. "And what would it give you?" The corner of Jake's mouth lifted in a small smile. "The chance to wake up every morning beside the bravest woman I've ever met. Seems like a fair trade to me." In that moment, looking into Jake Hampton's earnest blue eyes, Josephine realized she had fallen in love with him gradually, quietly, but completely. The thought of spending her life with this man, raising her child together, filled her with a joy she had not believed possible just months ago when she had fled Gonzales in shame and fear. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strengthening as she repeated, "Yes, I will marry you, Jake." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains, radiant and full of promise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Jake leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and over too soon. "When we reach Cottonwood Falls tomorrow," he murmured, "we'll find the preacher." True to his word, when the cattle drive stopped in Cottonwood Falls, Kansas the next day, Jake sought out the local preacher while Josephine, with Cookie's help, used some of her saved wages to purchase a simple but clean dress that would accommodate her growing figure. The ceremony took place that evening in the small white clapboard church on the edge of town. Cookie stood as witness, along with the local schoolteacher whom the preacher had summoned. Josephine wore wildflowers in her hair, hastily gathered by one of the younger cowboys who had taken a brotherly interest in her during the drive. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began as Josephine and Jake stood before him, hands clasped between them. The words of the ceremony washed over Josephine like a dream. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding day, far from home, in a stranger's church, wearing a hastily purchased dress. Yet as she looked into Jake's eyes, she found she wouldn't change a single detail. "I, Jacob Hampton, take thee, Josephine Valenti, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Jake recited, his deep voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it was her turn, Josephine's voice trembled slightly on the words, overcome by the enormity of the moment and the sincerity she saw in Jake's eyes. This was no marriage of convenience for him. She could see that now in every line of his face, every gentle touch of his hands. "By the power vested in me," the preacher concluded, I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Jake's kiss was different this time, still gentle, but with an underlying current of passion that made Josephine's heart race. When they parted, his smile was radiant. "Mrs. Hampton," he said softly, testing the name on his tongue. Josephine smiled back, her fear and uncertainty replaced by a cautious hope. "Mr. Hampton." They spent their wedding night in the town's small hotel, the first real bed either of them had slept in for weeks. Despite their new status as husband and wife, Jake insisted on taking the chair by the window, giving Josephine privacy and space. "We have time," he told her gently when she hesitantly questioned the arrangement. "I meant what I said, Josephine. I won't ask for anything you're not ready to give." His consideration only deepened her growing feelings for him. As she drifted to sleep in the unfamiliar comfort of a real bed, Josephine found herself thinking that perhaps, against all odds, her mistake had led her to the one man who could truly make her happy. The next morning, Jake surprised her with news that changed their plans entirely. "I've sold my share of the herd," he announced over breakfast in the hotel's small dining room. "Got a fair price, too. Enough to buy a small spread I've had my eye on about 20 miles north of here." Josephine stared at him in shock. "You're leaving the cattle drive." "But I thought that we'd continue to Abilene." Jake shook his head. "That was never the plan, not for you in your condition. The last part of the drive is the hardest, and Abilene's no place for a woman expecting a child." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I've been saving for years to buy my own land. The timing just moved up a bit. But the men your responsibilities, Cookie can lead them the rest of the way. He's done it before when I've been laid up." Jake's expression grew serious. "My responsibility now is to you and the child, our child." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes at the simple way he claimed her unborn baby as his own. "You've thought of everything." Jake's smile was tender. "Not everything. The place is just land and a small cabin right now. It'll be a far cry from what you're used to in Gonzales." "I stopped being that person the day I left," Josephine replied firmly. "I don't need luxury, Jake, just a home where my child can grow up without shame." "Our home," Jake corrected gently. "Our child." His hand tightened around hers. "No one in these parts needs to know anything different." 2 days later, after saying goodbye to Cookie and the Cowboys who had become like family, Jake and Josephine Hampton traveled by wagon to their new home. The property was simple but beautiful, 120 acres of rolling prairie with a stream cutting through it, a stand of cottonwoods providing shade, and a small but solid cabin nestled against a gentle rise. "It needs work," Jake admitted as he helped Josephine down from the wagon. "But the bones are good." Previous owner was a widower who went back east to live with his daughter. Josephine stood in the yard, taking in what would be her new home. The cabin was indeed rough, just one main room with a stone fireplace, a lean-to kitchen attached to the side, and what appeared to be a small bedroom at the back. But it was clean and sound, and with Jake beside her, it already felt more like home than the grand mansion in Gonzales ever had. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as they settled into their new life. Jake worked from dawn until dusk, repairing the roof, reinforcing the walls, adding a covered porch across the front of the cabin. Josephine planted a kitchen garden with seeds purchased from town, arranged their few possessions to make the cabin homey, and learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove. As her pregnancy progressed and her belly grew more pronounced, Jake became increasingly protective. He insisted she rest during the hottest part of the day and took over the heaviest chores without being asked. At night, he still slept on a pallet by the fireplace, giving Josephine the small bedroom, though the longing looks they exchanged grew more difficult to ignore. Their nearest neighbors, the Wilsons, lived 3 miles away and welcomed them warmly. Eleanor Wilson, a motherly woman in her 50s, took one look at Josephine's condition and immediately appointed herself as mentor and friend. "First baby's always the hardest," she told Josephine during one of her visits, her experienced eyes assessing Josephine's growing belly. "You look to be about 5 months along, due around Christmas, I'd say." Josephine nodded, grateful for Eleanor's matter-of-fact approach. The woman had asked no uncomfortable questions about when exactly the Hamptons had married or how long they had known each other. "I'm a bit frightened," Josephine admitted. "My mother never discussed such things with me." Eleanor patted her hand. "That's why God gave us neighbors, dear. I've helped bring more babies into this world than I can count. When your time comes, you send that husband of yours to fetch me." As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, Jake expanded the cabin, adding a proper second bedroom for the coming baby. Josephine sewed curtains from fabric purchased in town and quilted a small blanket for the cradle Jake was building in the evenings. Their life fell into a rhythm that brought Josephine more contentment than she had ever known. Jake was unfailingly kind, patient, and hardworking. He treated her with a gentle deference that made her heart ache with love for him. Yet he never pressed for more than the occasional kiss or touch of hands. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Josephine finally found the courage to broach the subject that had been on her mind. "Jake," she began hesitantly, "are you happy with our arrangement?" He turned to her, brows drawing together in confusion. "Our arrangement, our marriage," she clarified, hands nervously smoothing her dress over her rounded stomach. "You've been so patient, so kind, but it's not a real marriage, is it?" Understanding dawned in Jake's eyes, followed by something warmer. "It feels real to me, Josephine, but we don't." She blushed, unable to say the words. Jake took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I meant what I said when I proposed. I won't ask for anything you're not ready to give. And if I am ready—" The words came out barely above a whisper. Jake's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Are you sure, Josephine? Because once we cross that line, I don't think I could go back to sleeping by the fireplace." In answer, Josephine leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their previous kisses, which had been gentle and brief, she poured all her longing and love into this one. After a moment's hesitation, Jake responded, one hand coming up to cradle her face while the other remained respectfully at her waist. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've been half in love with you since that first day in Gonzales when you stood there in your fine dress asking for work," he admitted. "And completely in love with you since the night you accepted my proposal." Tears of joy welled in Josephine's eyes. "I love you too, Jake. I think I have for a long time." That night, Jake moved his few belongings into the main bedroom. Their coming together was sweet and tender, Jake treating Josephine with a reverence that made her feel cherished rather than experienced. In the warmth of his arms afterward, Josephine felt the last of her fears and doubts melt away. "This is what home feels like," she murmured against his chest. Jake kissed her hair. "Yes, it is." As winter approached, Jake worked tirelessly to ensure they were prepared for the harsh Kansas weather. He built up a supply of firewood that seemed excessive to Josephine until the first blizzard hit in early December, howling around their snug cabin for 3 days straight. "Good thing we're well stocked," Jake commented as he added another log to the fire. "First winter's always the hardest." Josephine, now heavily pregnant and finding movement increasingly difficult, smiled from her rocking chair where she was finishing a tiny cap for the baby. "You've thought of everything." Jake knelt beside her chair, placing a gentle hand on her swollen belly. As if in response, the baby kicked against his palm, bringing a look of wonder to his face. "Strong," he murmured. "Just like his mother, or her," Josephine reminded him with a smile. "It might be a girl," Jake grinned. "Either way, I already love this child, our child." The simple declaration brought tears to Josephine's eyes. In the month since their marriage, Jake had never once referred to the baby as anything but theirs. He spoke to her belly each night, telling stories of his day, making plans for teaching their child to ride, to fish in the stream, to recognize the constellations that wheeled overhead on clear nights. 2 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, Josephine woke in the pre-dawn darkness to a sharp pain low in her back. By the time Jake had stoked the fire and boiled water for coffee, she was certain. "Jake," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "I think it's time. The baby's coming." Jake's face paled beneath his tan, but his voice remained calm. "I'll hitch up the wagon and get a leaner." The 3-mile journey to the Wilsons' home and back seemed to take an eternity to Josephine, whose pains were coming steadily closer together. By the time Jake returned with a leaner, Josephine was kneeling beside the bed, gripping the frame through each contraction. "First babies often take their time," Alina reassured her as she efficiently organized the bedroom, sending Jake to boil more water and fetch clean linens. "But from the look of things, yours might be in a bit of a hurry." Alina's prediction proved accurate. After just 4 hours of labor, which seemed an eternity to Josephine, her son was born as the first light of Christmas Day filtered through the cabin windows. "A fine, strong boy," Alina announced, placing the squalling infant on Josephine's chest. "And a handsome one at that." Josephine stared in wonder at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers that curled reflexively around her own. All the pain, fear, and uncertainty of the past months dissolved in the overwhelming love that flooded through her. "Jake," she called softly, "come meet your son." Jake entered the room hesitantly, his face a mixture of awe and trepidation. When he saw Josephine cradling their son, tears sprang to his eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "What will you name him?" Alina asked as she finished cleaning up. Josephine looked at Jake questioningly. They had discussed names but made no final decision. "Matthew," Jake said softly. "Matthew Hampton." He met Josephine's eyes. "If that suits you." "Matthew," Josephine repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect. My father's middle name was Matthew." A pang of sadness touched her at the thought of her parents, who didn't know they had a grandson. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" she asked Jake, her voice small. Jake's expression softened with understanding. "One day, perhaps. When they realize what they've lost by holding on to their pride." Alina, sensing the private moment, quietly excused herself. "I'll come back tomorrow to check on you both. Jake knows where to find me if you need anything before then." After she left, Jake stretched out carefully beside Josephine on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand resting lightly on his son's back. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "After the war, after losing my brother, I thought I'd spend my life alone. Then you walked into my camp in that fancy dress, asking for work." His voice roughened with emotion. "You gave me a family, Josephine." Josephine leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart so full it might burst. "And you gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. You stood between me and shame, just as you promised." "And I always will," Jake vowed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always." As they lay together, The new family of three, snow began to fall outside, soft, silent flakes drifting past the window to blanket their land in pristine white. A clean slate, Josephine thought. A new beginning. Matthew grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with Jake's blue eyes and Josephine's dark hair. By his second birthday, he was running everywhere, getting into everything, and bringing constant joy to his parents' lives. The Hampton farm prospered under Jake's careful management. They added cattle, then horses, expanding their holdings to include the neighboring property when it came up for sale. Josephine kept a thriving vegetable garden and became known in the area for her preserves and baked goods, which she sold at the general store in town. In the spring of Matthew's third year, Josephine discovered she was expecting their second child. When she shared the news with Jake, his face lit with a joy that matched her own. "Another Christmas baby," he teased, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "More likely January," she replied, leaning into his embrace, "but close enough." The second pregnancy was easier than the first, though chasing after an active 3-year-old while carrying another child presented its own challenges. Jake hired a local boy to help with the heavier farm work so he could spend more time close to home. On a clear January morning in 1880, their daughter Elizabeth came into the world with considerably less drama than her brother, arriving after a relatively short labor with Eleanor Wilson, once again in attendance. "She's got your smile," Jake declared, cradling his newborn daughter with a tenderness that made Josephine's heart swell. Matthew, perched on the bed beside his mother, peered curiously at his baby sister. "She's small," he observed with a child's directness. "You were even smaller," Jake told him, ruffling his son's hair. "But look how big and strong you are now." As their family grew, so did their connection to the community. Jake served on the school board and helped organize the annual Harvest Festival. Josephine joined the church auxiliary and taught piano to neighborhood children. Their home became a gathering place for friends and neighbors, known for its warm hospitality and Josephine's excellent cooking. Yet despite her happiness, there remained a hollow space in Josephine's heart where her parents should have been. She had written to them after Matthew's birth, sending a carefully worded letter that explained her marriage to Jake without revealing the true timeline of events. The letter had gone unanswered, as had a second one sent after Elizabeth's arrival. "They're missing so much," she told Jake one evening as they sat on their expanded porch, watching Matthew and 4-year-old Elizabeth chasing fireflies in the twilight. "Sometimes I think about going back to Gonzales just to see them." Jake was quiet for a moment. "If that's what you want to do, I'll take you," he said finally. "The children should know their grandparents." Josephine squeezed his hand gratefully. "Maybe next spring," she said, "when the weather's better for traveling." But before spring arrived, a letter came that changed everything. It was addressed in her mother's elegant handwriting, the first communication from her family in nearly 5 years. With trembling fingers, Josephine opened it, scanning the contents as Jake watched her face anxiously. "My father had a stroke," she said, looking up with tear-filled eyes. "He's asking for me." Within days, they were on a train bound for Texas, Matthew and Elizabeth wide-eyed with excitement at their first railway journey. Josephine alternated between anxiety and hope. What would her parents think of Jake, of their grandchildren? Would they welcome her back? Or had her father summoned her merely to express his final disappointment? Gonzales looked both achingly familiar and strangely different when they arrived. New buildings had sprung up along Main Street, but the Valenti mansion on the hill looked exactly as Josephine remembered it. Martha, now gray-haired but still spry, met them at the door with tears and embraces. "Miss Josephine," she whispered, "you've finally come home. Is he?" Josephine couldn't finish the question. Still with us, Martha assured her. Weak but holding on. Your mother's with him now. Josephine introduced Jake and the children, her heart warming at the way Martha immediately swept Matthew and Elizabeth into her arms, exclaiming over how beautiful they were. Your mama knows you're coming, Martha said as she led them inside. She's been watching the road all morning. Josephine's mother, Victoria Valenti, looked older than her 50 years, care and worry having etched deep lines around her eyes and mouth. When she saw Josephine standing in the doorway of her father's sick room, she rose from her chair with a small cry. Josephine, she breathed, rushing forward to embrace her daughter. Oh, my darling girl. The simple gesture broke something inside Josephine. All the years of separation, of hurt and longing dissolved in her mother's arms as they both wept. I'm so sorry, Mama, Josephine whispered. No, my dear. We're the ones who should be sorry. Victoria pulled back to look at her daughter's face. We should have tried to find you sooner. Your father has been consumed with regret. On the bed, Bartholomew Valenti stirred. One side of his face drooped from the stroke, but his eyes were clear and alert as they fixed on his daughter. Papa, Josephine said softly, moving to his bedside and taking his good hand. His fingers tightened around hers. Daughter, he managed, the words slurred but unmistakable. I've brought my family to meet you, Josephine told him, motioning for Jake and the children to come forward. This is my husband, Jake Hampton, and these are your grandchildren, Matthew and Elizabeth. Something that might have been a smile touched the undamaged side of Bartholomew's face as he looked at the children. His eyes moved to Jake, assessing. Jake stepped forward, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Sir, he said respectfully, I wish we could have met under better circumstances. Bartholomew studied him for a long moment before turning his gaze back to Josephine. With effort, he formed his next words carefully. You, happy, tears welled in Josephine's eyes. Yes, Papa, very happy. The old man nodded once, satisfaction in his eyes. Then, with great effort, he raised his good hand toward the children. Matthew, normally shy with strangers, stepped forward without hesitation and placed his small hand in his grandfather's. You look like your mama, Bartholomew said, the words slow but clear. That evening, after the children had been settled in Josephine's old bedroom, Victoria invited Jake and Josephine to join her in the study, the room that had once been Bartholomew's domain. Your father's lawyer will be here tomorrow, she told Josephine. He's made changes to his will. He wants to ensure you and your children are provided for. Josephine glanced at Jake, who sat quietly beside her. We don't need money, Mama. Jake has built a good life for us in Kansas. Nevertheless, Victoria insisted, you are a Valenti. Your children are Valentis, regardless of their name. It is their birthright. Jake spoke up for the first time since entering the room. With all due respect, Mrs. Valenti, Matthew and Elizabeth are Hamptons. They're being raised with values that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Instead of being offended, Victoria regarded Jake with new respect. You love my daughter very much, don't you? More than my own life, Jake answered simply. Victoria nodded as if confirming something to herself. When you disappeared, she said to Josephine, your father was furious. He thought you'd run off with some unsuitable young man. He hired detectives to find you. Josephine gasped. I had no idea. They traced you as far as the cattle drive but lost your trail after that. Victoria's eyes were sad. By the time we received your first letter, your father's pride wouldn't let him respond. It was his greatest regret, especially after the second letter with news of Elizabeth. She rose and went to a desk in the corner, returning with a small leather-bound book. He kept them, you know. Your letters. Read them so often the paper began to wear thin. Josephine took the book with trembling hands. Inside were her 2 letters carefully preserved between the pages. "We'd like to be part of your lives," Victoria continued. "If you'll allow it. We've lost too much time already." Josephine looked at Jake, who nodded his support. "We'd like that too, Mama." Bartholomew Valenti lived another 6 months, long enough to see his grandchildren become comfortable with him, to hear Matthew read his first simple book aloud, to see Elizabeth take her first wobbly steps across the study floor. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, Josephine grieved the father she had known in those last months, rather than the stern banker who had dominated her youth. As stipulated in his will, a trust was established for Matthew and Elizabeth to fund their education and provide them with opportunities that Jake and Josephine might not otherwise have been able to afford. Victoria sold the Gonzales mansion and divided her time between a smaller home in town and extended visits to the Hampton farm in Kansas. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Jake surprised Josephine with a gift: the deed to the adjacent property, expanding their farm to over 300 acres. "Room to grow," he told her with a meaningful glance at her midsection, where their 3rd child, a boy they would name James, was just beginning to make his presence known. That night, lying in bed with Jake's arms around her, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought her from frightened pregnant girl to confident woman, wife, and mother. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Marrying me, taking on another man's child as your own?" Jake propped himself up on one elbow to look down at her, his face serious in the moonlight that filtered through their bedroom window. "Josephine Hampton, meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You and those children are the center of my world." He placed a gentle hand on her stomach. "All of them. Even when Matthew is at his most stubborn," she teased. Jake laughed. "Especially then. He reminds me of his mother." Josephine swatted his arm playfully before her expression grew serious again. "I was so afraid when I left Gonzales. I couldn't imagine a future that wasn't shadowed by shame and judgment." She reached up to touch his face. "You gave me so much more than protection, Jake. You gave me love when I least deserved it." "You deserved everything then, and you deserve everything now," Jake said, lowering his head to kiss her tenderly. "And I intend to spend the rest of our lives proving it to you." As summer turned to fall and then to winter, the Hampton farm continued to thrive. Their children grew strong and healthy, their land productive, their love deepening with each passing year. The journey that had begun in fear and shame had led Josephine to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined on that dawn in Gonzales, when she had first realized she was with child. And through it all, true to his word, Jake Hampton stood between her and shame, replacing judgment with acceptance, fear with security, loneliness with family. In his love, Josephine had found not just shelter from the storm, but the courage to embrace the sunshine that followed.